They believed removing his trees would give them the perfect lakeside panorama. What happened afterward, however, changed that view forever. This is the story of the moment everything shifted, and how one quiet decision became the biggest mistake they never expected. Ethan had called his lakeside home for more than 10 years. The towering pine trees surrounding the property weren't simply landscaping. They were part of his everyday life. They provided privacy, cool shade, and the peaceful atmosphere that made the place feel truly his. Every morning, the sunlight filtered gently through the branches, painting soft patterns across his porch. Life there was calm. It was peaceful, until one afternoon it wasn't. Ethan pulled into his driveway and instantly sensed something was wrong. The air felt different. The sunlight seemed too bright. The familiar shadows had vanished. Then he saw why. Where a row of tall, beautiful pine trees had once stood, there was now nothing but open space. Freshly cut stumps, clean saw marks, and complete silence. For several moments, he simply stared, trying to understand what he was looking at, because those trees hadn't fallen during a storm. They had been deliberately removed, and someone had made that decision without ever speaking to him. The explanation appeared almost immediately from the neighboring property. Several residents stood together near the property line, quietly chatting. Their home sat slightly higher than his, and with the trees gone, they now enjoyed a clear, uninterrupted view of the lake. Ethan didn't really need an explanation, but he asked anyway. Their response was surprisingly casual. They talked about improving the scenery, mentioned neighborhood appearance, and claimed it would increase everyone's property values. One of them even smiled, almost expecting him to appreciate what they had done. Ethan listened without raising his voice or showing anger. He remained completely calm, because sometimes silence carries more weight than shouting. Finally, he asked one simple question. "Did anyone ask for my permission?" The reply was equally simple. No, the HOA approved it. They explained that the decision had been made during a homeowners meeting Ethan hadn't attended. According to them, everything had been done within community guidelines. But guidelines can never replace basic respect, and approval doesn't cancel private ownership. Ethan looked back toward the empty stretch of land, the missing trees, and the newly exposed view. In that quiet moment, something inside him changed. If they wanted a better view so badly, then they had unknowingly given him the opportunity to decide exactly what that view would become. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't demand compensation or start a confrontation. Instead, he quietly walked back inside his home, closed the front door, and sat alone in silence. The lake still sparkled in the distance, but it no longer felt the same. The space where those trees had once stood now felt exposed, incomplete, and above all, it felt stolen. Later that evening, Ethan spread his property documents across the table. He carefully reviewed every boundary line, every recorded detail, and every legal clause, taking his time to understand every word. Because sometimes the strongest solution isn't emotional. It's precise. Then he discovered something that made him stop reading for a moment. Hidden within the documents was a section that most people would probably overlook. It explained not only ownership of the land itself, but also the legal rights to install structures, barriers, and visual obstructions anywhere within that property. Ethan leaned back in his chair as an idea quietly took shape. It wasn't driven by anger or revenge. It came from complete clarity. If the trees were gone forever, then something else could stand in their place. Something entirely within his legal rights. Something permanent. And something nobody would have any authority to challenge. Construction started the following week. At first, the neighbors paid little attention. A few work trucks arrived. Building materials were unloaded. Contractors calmly went about their jobs, following detailed instructions. Ethan personally supervised every step of the project, remaining quiet, focused, and determined. As the new structure slowly began taking shape, curiosity quickly turned into concern. Because this wasn't landscaping. It wasn't decorative work. It was something entirely different. A solid, carefully engineered privacy barrier slowly rose along the exact property line where the pine trees had once stood. It was strong, tall, and positioned perfectly within Ethan's legal boundaries. By the second day, nobody could ignore what was happening. The open lake view that had once stretched endlessly across the neighborhood was steadily disappearing behind the growing structure. The same neighbors gathered together once again. Only this time their expressions had changed. Confusion replaced confidence. Concern replaced satisfaction. And realization slowly settled in. They approached Ethan, asking questions, offering suggestions, and tried to understand exactly what he was building. Ethan calmly gave them the only answer they needed. "It's on my property." Nothing more had to be said. By the end of the week, the project was finished. Standing where the trees had once grown was a tall, elegant privacy wall. It hadn't been rushed or poorly built. Every detail had been carefully designed so it blended naturally with the property, while completely blocking the lake beyond. The water was still there exactly as before, but now nobody else could see it. The same neighbors who had once enjoyed an uninterrupted view now found themselves looking directly at a solid wall. They immediately turned to the HOA, expecting officials to step in. This time, however, everything was different. Ethan had followed every rule perfectly. Every measurement, every permit, every regulation, every approval. Everything matched the same rules the HOA had relied upon before. Only now those rules were working for him instead. The meeting that followed was remarkably quiet. There were no heated debates and very few objections because the facts were impossible to dispute. Something that had been taken without permission had simply been replaced with something nobody had the legal authority to challenge. As the days passed, the neighborhood slowly accepted its new reality. The beautiful lake view had disappeared, replaced by a constant reminder of what had happened. Ethan never celebrated the outcome. He never acted smug or satisfied. Instead, he simply returned to the life he had always enjoyed. Morning coffee on the porch. Quiet evening walks beside the water. His peace no longer came from the scenery itself. It came from knowing his property was once again under his own control. Over time, the neighbors adjusted. Conversations throughout the community gradually changed. People became more thoughtful, more respectful, and much more careful before making decisions involving someone else's property. Because everyone had learned an important lesson. Every action has consequences. Sometimes those consequences last forever. Not long afterward, the HOA updated its policies, adding much clearer protections for individual property rights. The changes weren't introduced as punishment. They were intended to prevent another mistake like this from ever happening again, because everyone now understood that certain boundaries simply should never be crossed. In the end, the lake itself never changed. The water continued reflecting the sky. The sunlight still shimmered across its surface, exactly as it always had. What changed was the way people looked at it. One evening, Ethan stood quietly beside his window, looking toward the place where his trees had once stood. He felt no regret about the decision he had made, because it had never been about blocking anyone's view. It had always been about restoring balance, respect, and the rights of ownership. Eventually, the neighbors stopped talking about what they had lost because deep down, they already knew why it had happened. It wasn't an act of anger. It was simply a response. A calm, measured, and carefully planned response that nobody could successfully argue against. And that was the real twist. They wanted a better view. Instead, they lost it completely. That was the unforgettable ending to this unbelievable HOA story. If you enjoyed the drama, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing what you think. Your support truly helps the channel continue growing.